Before the prairie learned your name, before Kansas was tamed by fences and law, there was a warning whispered into the wind. It said this: some protections devour what they are meant to guard. If you are hearing this, you were never meant to. In 1854, Kansas was not yet a state. It was an experiment, a raw, bleeding stretch of land where power had no uniform and survival answered to no court. This was the year maps lied, records vanished, and men became myths while still breathing. It was also the year a widow made a choice that history buried on purpose. Her name does not matter anymore. Names are for the protected. What matters is what she saw, and what she traded to stay alive. She had already learned the first forbidden lesson of frontier America. The law arrives last. Her husband died under circumstances that never reached ink or gavel. A shallow grave. A closed mouth. In Kansas Territory, widows were currency. Land could be taken. Bodies could be used. Silence could be forced. And then there was Jakab. They called him Big Jakab not because it sounded impressive, but because language failed. 8 feet tall, they said. Hands like tools. A spine bent slightly forward, as if the world itself pushed down on him harder than other men. He did not farm. He did not preach. He did not argue. He stood. People noticed something unsettling. Violence did not approach him. Not because he chased it away, because it chose not to come close. In a territory ruled by intimidation, that made him valuable. This is where the lie begins. You were taught that marriage was safety, that alignment with power is protection, that proximity to a feared man keeps the wolves out. But those stories are written by institutions that survive on your obedience, not your understanding. The widow did not marry for love. She married for jurisdiction, for the shadow Jakab cast across a land, for the message his presence sent to men who counted women as spoil. And at first, it worked. No one crossed her fence. No one touched her stores. No one spoke her name at night. Order, imposed by fear, wrapped itself around her like armor. But armor has an interior. What history does not teach you is this: when you outsource your safety to power, you invite power into your home. When you bind yourself to a protector whose authority is unspoken and unchecked, you do not gain freedom. You surrender authorship. This story is not about a giant. It is about a system. A pattern repeated across centuries. Individuals aligning with something larger, darker, more dominant, believing control can be borrowed without cost. Kansas, 1854, was only the stage. Big Jakab did not arrive with vows. He arrived with silence. Witnesses later struggled to recall his voice, as if the act of remembering it caused discomfort. What they remembered instead was how rooms felt smaller when he entered them, how conversations shortened, how men unconsciously stepped aside. Power like that does not announce itself. It edits behavior. The widow believed she understood the arrangement. She would provide legitimacy, a roof, a name attached to land. In return, Jakab would stand between her and the chaos that consumed and guarded women on the frontier. It was not romance. It was a contract written in fear, the oldest ink in human history. At first, Jakab did exactly what was expected. He repaired nothing unless told. He hunted without speaking of it. He slept little. When men passed the property line, they turned away without explanation. Rumors spread quickly, and rumors are a form of governance. Kansas Territory had no stable institutions yet, so myth filled the vacuum. But something subtle began to shift inside the house. Protection, when constant, becomes surveillance. The widow noticed how Jakab always knew where she was. Not because he followed her, but because the house itself seemed to orient around him. Doors closed more softly. Floors creaked less. Even daylight felt filtered, as if permission were required. He never struck her. That is important. Violence would have made the story simple, and simple stories survive. What replaced violence was dominance without motion. Decisions she did not remember agreeing to were suddenly final. Paths she once walked freely now felt incorrect, though no rule forbade them. This is how control systems actually function. Not through chains, but through environmental pressure. Not through orders, but through inevitability. Neighbors stopped visiting, not because Jakab threatened them, but because being near him disrupted their sense of proportion. He reminded them of something primitive, something that did not fit the narrative of progress and settlement. In a land trying desperately to civilize itself, Jakab was a contradiction that could not be resolved. The widow began to understand the second forbidden lesson. Protection that cannot be questioned becomes authority. Authority that is never spoken becomes absolute. At night, she heard him standing outside, unmoving, facing the dark prairie, not guarding against intruders, but listening, as if something vast and unseen communicated through stillness, as if he were not merely a man, but an instrument. History will later call men like Jakab anomalies, outliers, genetic accidents. That language is intentional. It prevents pattern recognition. Because Jakab was not unique. He was an alien expression of a force that institutions would later learn to replicate without bodies, without giants, without witnesses. And by the time the widow realized she had not married a man, but submitted to a system, it was already too late to leave. The prairie teaches men quickly, but it teaches women faster. The widow began to sense that her safety no longer belonged to her. It had been absorbed, redirected. Whatever force Jakab represented did not merely repel danger. It reorganized reality around itself. And she was now inside that reorganization. She noticed it in small denials. Her letters went unanswered. Not intercepted, just unanswered, as if the world beyond the property had gradually forgotten her relevance. Supply wagons delayed. Familiar faces passed without acknowledgement. This was not isolation enforced by walls. It was isolation produced by gravity. Everything simply fell away. Jakab never explained himself. Explanations invite negotiation. He did not negotiate. When she asked questions, he looked at her, not with anger, not with threat, but with something colder. Assessment. As if he were measuring whether the question itself was necessary. This is how institutional power trains compliance. It does not punish curiosity immediately. It makes curiosity feel inefficient. She began to adjust her behavior without being told. She stopped asking, stopped writing, stopped imagining alternatives. The part of her that once planned for futures narrowed into a single objective: maintain equilibrium. Do not disrupt the force that keeps chaos out. Men today call this stability. History books call it order. But order imposed without consent is simply a quieter form of captivity. Whispers followed them when they traveled. Stories grew darker with distance. Some said Jakab had killed men without touching them. Others said animals refused to approach him. One preacher claimed Jakab was a test sent by God, a boundary marker between the obedient and the defiant. Notice the pattern. Whenever something cannot be controlled, it is reframed as divine or monstrous. Both labels remove responsibility from those who benefit from its existence. The widow began to dream differently. Not nightmares. Those are obvious, but dreams without faces, without agency. Dreams where she moved through spaces already decided, where paths existed only because someone else had carved them long ago. She would wake with the sensation that something had been taken, but no memory of when. Jakab, meanwhile, seemed unchanged. Time did not mark him the way it marked others. He did not age forward. He endured. This unsettled her more than rage ever could. It suggested permanence. And permanence, when paired with dominance, is the most dangerous promise a human can make. You have been taught to fear tyrants who shout. But history is not ruled by noise. It is ruled by presence. By those who make resistance feel pointless before it is even attempted. The widow was beginning to understand the third forbidden lesson. The most effective control systems do not restrict movement. They redefine possibility. And once possibility collapses, escape becomes a concept, not an action. The first time the widow considered leaving, she realized she no longer knew how. Not practically. She could pack. She could walk. But internally, the idea of departure felt undefined, like trying to imagine a color you were never taught existed. This is the hidden function of domination. It does not block exits. It erases the map. Jakab never forbade her from going. He never needed to. His presence had rewritten the rules of consequence. Outside the land, she sensed exposure. Inside it, erasure. She had traded one danger for another, but only one of them wore a human shape. The prairie began to change around the house. Grass flattened in unnatural arcs. Fence posts leaned inward, not from rut but from pressure, as if something heavier than wind passed through at night. Animals avoided the property line. Birds altered their routes. These details never made it into records, because records only capture what institutions are prepared to acknowledge. She tried once to speak to a circuit judge passing through. Jakab stood several paces behind her, silent. The judge answered politely, nodded, promised nothing, and left without writing a single note. Later, she would understand that authority recognizes authority, and it always defers to the greater presence. This is how power protects itself across generations, not through explicit alliances, but through instinctive alignment. Men in power sense other power the way predators sense weight in water. At home, Jakab's stillness grew heavier. He began standing inside the house at night, facing walls instead of windows. When she asked why, he answered with his first complete sentence in months. He said, quietly, that some things do not come from outside. That sentence mattered. It marked the moment she understood that her marriage was no longer about protection from men. It was about containment. Her identity thinned. Not erased, refined, reduced to function. She kept the house. She maintained appearances. She absorbed silence. This was not cruelty. This was optimization. Systems do not hate you. They use you until there is nothing inefficient left. You have been taught that corruption looks like excess. But the oldest corruption looks like order so tight it suffocates choice. Like lives arranged for maximum predictability. Like safety purchased at the price of authorship. In later years, historians would dismiss accounts of Big Jakab as frontier exaggeration. They would say 8 feet tall is impossible. They would say fear stretches memory. That myth grows where education is thin. That dismissal is the final layer of control. Because once something is labeled impossible, it can operate freely in another form. The widow was not living with a giant anymore. She was living inside a prototype. The realization did not arrive as panic. Panic is loud and burns quickly. What settled over the widow was colder comprehension. She began to see patterns, not just in her own life, but in the territory itself. The way disputes dissolved when Jakab's name was mentioned. The way land claims shifted quietly. The way Satan men prospered simply by aligning themselves nearby, without ever speaking to him directly. Jakab was not enforcing order. He was anchoring it. This is a distinction most men never learn. Enforcement requires effort. Anchoring changes gravity. Once gravity shifts, everything else adjusts automatically. Institutions dream of this kind of power. In 1854 Kansas, they were witnessing it in its raw, biological form. The widow noticed that people no longer asked her questions. They asked her through Jakab, even when he was not present. Her opinions were filtered before being heard. Her concerns translated into logistics. This is how systems erase individuals without violence. They convert voice into data. She tried to remember who she had been before. Not the events, those were easy, but the internal posture. The way her mind once leaned forward instead of inward. The way decisions felt open-ended. That posture was gone. In its place was calibration. Constant adjustment to an unspoken standard. Jakab never demanded obedience. That would have created resistance. Instead, he embodied consequence. And consequence, when made ambient, trains behavior more efficiently than fear ever could. At night, she began to notice something else. Jakab did not sleep like a man protecting a household. He slept like a man guarding a perimeter that extended beyond walls, beyond land, beyond time. When he woke, it was never in response to sound. It was as if he responded to imbalance. This disturbed her more than any threat, because it suggested that whatever Jakab was connected to did not operate on human schedules or moral categories. It was not good or evil. It was corrective. You must understand this if you want to understand power. The most dangerous forces do not see themselves as cruel. They see themselves as necessary. The widow considered confession, writing everything down, leaving a record. But she understood the futility instinctively. Records require institutions willing to preserve them, and institutions had already chosen which version of reality they preferred. So she did the only thing left to men and women trapped inside systems larger than themselves. She watched. She memoized details. She noted shifts. She became an internal witness, not because she believed rescue was coming, but because some truths resist erasure when held precisely. That decision would save nothing in her lifetime, but it would make her dangerous in a way Jakab could not immediately detect. Because systems can sense rebellion, they struggle to detect awareness. Awareness changes posture before it changes action. The widow did not resist. She refined her attention. She began to notice that Jakab's influence fluctuated, not weakened, but pulsed. There were moments when the air around him felt denser, as if something unseen leaned closer. Other moments, rare and brief, when the house felt almost ordinary. Those moments terrified her more than the heavy ones, because they revealed dependency. Jakab was not the source. He was a conduit. This is where the story turns from folklore into forbidden history. Men like Jakab appear in periods of institutional infancy, frontiers, collapses, transitions, when formal power has not yet solidified. They are tolerated, even protected, because they stabilize chaos without requiring structure. Later, when systems mature, men like Jakab are erased, discredited, or absorbed into myth. Their function is remembered. Their existence is denied. The widow realized that what she lived inside was not marriage, but early-stage governance. She tested this understanding carefully. Once, she moved an object in the house without telling him. Not something meaningful. A chair. Jakab noticed instantly. He did not correct it. He adjusted his position to compensate, standing where the imbalance had been created. The message was not anger. It was calibration. Another time, she spoke aloud a plan to visit a neighboring settlement. Jakab did not respond. The next morning, the wagon wheel cracked without explanation. No confrontation. No prohibition. Just outcome. This is how psychological control operates at its highest level. It does not argue with intention. It edits results until intention rulines. The widow began to see the larger implication. If a single man could anchor order this effectively, what could a network do? What could an invisible system achieve once it learned to replicate presence without flesh? You live under those systems now. You are told they are for your protection. That alignment brings safety. That dissent invites chaos. These are not lies. They are incomplete truths, framed to remove your authorship while preserving functionality. The widow's fear transformed. It was no longer fear of Jakab. It was fear of what would come after him, of what would learn from him. She began to suspect that her role was not accidental. Widows, after all, already exist outside male protection structures. They are socially unanchored, perfect test subjects for new forms of order. If she could be stabilized, anyone could. At night, she no longer dreamed of escape. She dreamed of transmission, of knowledge passing quietly, like a disease that does not announce itself until it is fully integrated. This is the moment history avoids. The moment a victim becomes a witness, and a witness, once fully aware, becomes a liability. Jakab had not yet noticed, but systems always do. The first sign that the system had noticed her awareness was not confrontation. It was refinement. Jakab's movements became more precise. His positioning inside the house subtly shifted, not to restrict her, but to reduce unpredictability. This is how intelligent control responds to consciousness. It does not crush it. It optimizes around it. The widow understood then that she was being studied. Not as a woman, not as a wife, as a variable. Her usefulness was no longer limited to legitimacy or appearance. She was now a feedback mechanism. Her reactions, hesitation, compliance, curiosity, fed something larger than Jakab himself. Whatever anchored through him adjusted in response to her internal state. She could feel it, the way one feels pressure changes before a storm. She tested the boundary of her own thoughts. When she felt resentment, the house grew heavier. When she surrendered internally, things smoothed. The conclusion was unavoidable and terrifying. Emotional alignment mattered more than behavior. Obedience was no longer physical. It was psychological. This is the architecture of modern domination, still misunderstood by most men. You are not controlled by force. You are regulated by responsiveness. Systems learn what you tolerate, then build environments that reward tolerance and punish deviation without ever naming it. Jakab spoke more often now, but only in fragments. Statements without context. Observations without explanation. Balance restored. Pressure resolved. Necessary adjustment. Each phrase stripped events of human meaning and replaced them with technical language. Once suffering is described clinically, resistance appears irrational. The widow felt herself becoming smaller, not in importance, but in dimensionality. Her life flattened into function. She was no longer living forward. She was maintaining continuity. This is the quiet death institutions prefer. It leaves bodies intact and legacies manageable. Outside, Kansas territory moved toward statehood. Laws were drafted. Borders formalized. Civilization advanced. and with it came the illusion that the frontier phase had ended. But the widow knew better. The frontier had simply moved inward. Jakab was no longer necessary forever. He was necessary temporarily. A scaffold. A bridge between chaos and structure. Once the structure could stand alone, men like him would be inconvenient. She wondered if Jakab knew this. If somewhere behind his stillness, there was awareness of his own disposability. Or if he, too, was merely fulfilling a role designed to be erased once complete. That thought changed something inside her. For the first time, she did not see Jakab as her captor. She saw him as another layer of containment. And beneath that realization was a darker one still. Systems do not fear giants. They fear men who understand the system itself. The widow began to behave exactly as expected, and that was the point. She cooked the same meals, walked the same paths, spoke the same measured words. Routine became camouflage. To an untrained eye, this looked like submission. In reality, it was discipline. She was no longer reacting to the system around her. She was insulating herself from it. Men who survive long-term control do not rebel loudly. They reduce signal. They become unreadable. She discovered that Jakab did not track her actions. He tracked deviation. As long as her behavior stayed within a narrow, predictable range, the pressure eased. This taught her something crucial. The system did not require obedience. It required stability. Once stability was achieved, individuality became irrelevant. This is how institutions preserve themselves without appearing cruel. They reward sameness and let difference starve. With this understanding, she began to test inwardly, never outwardly. She allowed her thoughts to fracture in silence. She remembered who she had been before the marriage, not with nostalgia, but with precision. Memory, she realized, was the lost territory not yet occupied. As long as she could remember without expressing, she retained a core the system could not fully access. Jakab seemed calmer during this period. His presence softened, almost receded. This confirmed her suspicion that awareness, once hidden, was harder to suppress than resistance. Resistance triggers correction. Awareness, properly concealed, becomes parasitic. It feeds without being seen. She noticed something else as well. Jakab's moments of stillness grew longer, but his recovery slower. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The conduit was straining. Whatever moved through him required constant equilibrium, and equilibrium was becoming harder to maintain as formal institutions strengthened around them. Courts, sheriffs, and councils were taking shape. Order no longer needed to be anchored by a giant standing in a field. This was the quiet betrayal no one records. When systems mature, they discard their early tools. The widow understood now why fear had followed Jakab like a shadow. It was not fear of his strength. It was fear of what he represented, a reminder that control once had a face, and faces invite questions. She began to sense that the end would not be violent. It would be administrative. Reclassification. Disappearance through explanation. Jakab would become a rumor, then a joke, then nothing at all. And she would be expected to continue as if none of it had mattered. That was the final insult systems reserved for their witnesses. To survive power is one thing. To be forced to forget it existed is another. And the widow made a decision then, quietly, without movement. She would remember everything. By midwinter, the widow understood the true depth of what she had entered. The house itself seemed to pulse with expectation, as if the walls had absorbed more than timber and nails. They had absorbed obedience, fear, and anticipation. Jakab's shadow was no longer a physical presence. It had become a force field, bending space, regulating the rhythms of her day, dictating the pace of thought without uttering a command. She began to sense that survival was not about evading danger. It was about mastering perception, seeing patterns others could not, and learning which truths to act upon, and which to conceal. Every encounter with a neighbor, every passing traveler, became a study in pretense. People behaved differently when Jakab was visible. Even in his absence, the invisible anchor of his power distorted their choices. They aligned automatically, a phenomenon she would later recognize as the first layer of institutional control. Systems, she realized, rarely need agents. They need templates of expectation. Once the template is internalized by enough people, enforcement becomes almost unnecessary. She began to notice subtler changes, small cracks in the mental architecture of her own autonomy. Decisions she thought were his were quietly influenced by his presence. A glance, a posture, the weight of his body in a doorway, all conveyed instructions she could not ignore. And the terrifying truth settled in. Dominance does not require overt coercion. It works through anticipation, the way a tide bends reeds before it breaks them. Night brought no relief. The prairie, once silent, now felt like an extension of Jakab's awareness. Sounds she had ignored, the snap of ice on water, the distant howl of coyotes, now carried intention. She began to catalogue these signs, realizing instinctively that awareness alone was a shield. Observation was her weapon. She tracked patterns, responses, and rhythms, because comprehension is the only immunity against a system you cannot confront physically. This was the fourth forbidden lesson. Power that cannot be seen is more terrifying than power that strikes. Visible threats can be fought. Invisible calibration can only be endured, or mastered. She felt herself shrinking inward, building a mental fortress where no one, not even Jakab, could reach her completely. She started documenting mentally, encoding events in sequences, patterns, and symbols. Each day, she stored knowledge for future retrieval. One day, she thought, the right context would come. The system that had anchored itself through Jakab would not recognize its own vulnerabilities in her mind. And in that silence, a decision crystallized. She would not simply survive. She would understand. And in understanding, she would reclaim something the system had assumed was lost, authorship over her own perception. The widow had become a witness. But witnesses, she knew, can also become disruptors. Spring arrived, and with it a subtle shift in the world outside the property line. Kansas territory was changing. Settlers arrived, sheriffs were appointed, and laws were drafted that pretended to impose order where chaos had once reigned. But the widow realized quickly that these structures were superficial. They masked the deeper force at work, the same force that had brought Jakab to her door. Institutional power always arrives late, but when it does, it absorbs the anchors that came before. Giants like Jakab vanish, and the order they enforce becomes invisible. Inside the house, Jakab remained unchanged. He moved with the same deliberate economy, standing where he needed to stand, listening where he needed to listen. Yet she sensed a fissure forming, subtle and almost imperceptible. The system had begun to integrate with the formal institutions outside. Its raw, untested power was no longer required in full. It needed only to stabilize while society caught up, and the widow understood what that meant. Her role as a vessel of observation was becoming even more critical. She had been granted access to something before history refined it. She began to notice patterns in the behaviors of those who visited the property. Traders, neighbors, even officials. They were not consciously aware of the influence Jakab had wielded. Yet their choices, their hesitations, and even the way they measured her responses revealed a latent obedience. The system had left traces of itself in every human it touched. The widow catalogued these traces meticulously, realizing that comprehension, not rebellion, was the most potent form of resistance. Jakab spoke rarely, but his words now carried layers of meaning she could decode. "The balance shifts," he said one evening, standing at the threshold of the dining room. She understood that this was not a warning to her, but an observation of the invisible equilibrium he saved. Every action she took now had to account for forces she could not see, yet could feel. A network of influence stretching beyond fences, beyond land, beyond even life itself. Her nights remained restless, but her dreams had changed. They no longer portrayed simple fate. Instead, they were studies of systems, of cause and effect, of dominance and compliance. She visualized sequences, patterns, and feedback loops, turning the terror she once felt into a mental map. In those dreams, she began to see the first glimmers of a dangerous truth. The real power was not the giant. The real power was the structure that enabled him, and the obedience it quietly demanded. Halfway through the story, the widow looked directly at the invisible audience she imagined. "Type iron will in the comments," she would say. "Type iron will again. Not for show, not for vanity, but to lock in the identity transformation, the acknowledgement that awareness itself is the first act of freedom." It was subtle, symbolic, and necessary. And in that acknowledgement, she realized something darker. Knowledge changes the observer. Once you see the patterns, you cannot unsee them. Once you comprehend the architecture of control, you are never fully innocent again. You are, instead, awake. She had crossed the threshold into a new territory, understanding power from inside the cage it creates. And the cage, she now knew, was far larger than any one giant. Summer came, and with it the illusion of normalcy. Fields grew, crops ripened, neighbors smiled. But the widow saw the cracks beneath this veneer. The system Jakab embodied had begun to teach itself lessons from the formalizing institutions. Patterns once crude were now refined, moving invisibly through contracts, through approvals, through custom and law. Jakab no longer needed to be present in full force. His shadow had been codified into the behaviors of men, the rhythm of labor, and the assumptions of society. She observed this quietly, recording every detail mentally. Each step, each hesitation, each instinctive deference was a data point. The widow realized that true control is less about threat and more about expectation. When people anticipate dominance, they enact it unconsciously. Compliance becomes habitual before it is recognized. And the system, once anchored by a giant, now flowed naturally through those it had shaped. Jakab remained a physical monument, yet she noticed his authority had begun to rely less on intimidation and more on perception. He no longer needed to act. Presence alone sufficed. Even she, who understood his mechanisms, felt the subtle pull of alignment. This was the paradox of mastery. Comprehension does not grant immunity from influence. Awareness reduces uncertainty but cannot erase the architecture of gravity that surrounds power. In private, she experimented. She tested limits, introduced small deviations, and noted the system's responses. Doors closed slightly differently. Tools moved in unexpected ways. Animals hesitated in paths they once crossed freely. The invisible framework reacted instantaneously, adjusting without a word. She saw clearly that this was how history perpetuates control, not through violence, but through adaptation. Systems learn, and they never forget. She began to document herself internally as both participant and observer, knowing that memory is a weapon against erasure. Every nuance, every adjustment, every silent calibration was stored. She understood that when the giant vanished, the knowledge of his function would remain. The widow's mind became a repository of forbidden truth, truths that could outlast physical presence, outlast rumors, outlast men. This phase taught her a fifth lesson. Systems favor endurance over expression. Loud acts of rebellion are noticed. Quiet awareness, carefully cultivated, is almost invisible. The system cannot suppress what does not broadcast itself, yet it cannot ignore the subtle shifts that indicate consciousness. And so, she continued, not in rebellion, but in observation. She became the record keeper of forces that could not be named, the witness to a frontier power that predated law, and the only one capable of mapping its patterns. Jakab watched, mostly still, mostly silent. But she knew he understood that her awareness was the first variable the system could not fully predict. And in that, a dangerous possibility began to form. She was no longer just surviving. She was learning the blueprint of dominance itself. By late summer, the widow understood something profoundly unsettling. Jakab was not the apex. He was the interface. The real power flowed through him, but it did not originate there. It originated in patterns, in anticipations, in the invisible network of influence that humans construct whenever hierarchy meets fear. The giant was a tool, a visible anchor for invisible forces, and the widow was beginning to see the system in its raw form. Every encounter outside her property revealed it further. Men deferred automatically, even when Jakab was absent. Decisions, conversations, and small acts of civility followed an unspoken rhythm dictated by a presence that had never been formally recognized. Authority, she realized, is not merely enforced, it is internalized. Once internalized, it requires neither guards nor weapons to sustain itself. The human mind, trained by observation and habit, enforces its own chains. The widow tested this subtly. She rearranged objects, left spaces unused, and deliberately deviated from routine in minor ways. The responses were never dramatic. No one shouted. No one confronted her. The house itself adjusted. The floorboards creaked differently. Tools appeared in slightly altered positions. Even the animals hesitated. The system responded without direction, almost instinctively. It was alive. It was learning. She realized the sixth forbidden truth. Systems cannot be fought like humans. They must be understood. They evolve. They calibrate. Every attempt at confrontation triggers adaptation. Every act of defiance leaves traces that the system absorbs, making future compliance easier to enforce. Awareness is the only defense. Knowledge is the only leverage. Jakab remained her constant, yet even he seemed slightly diminished, as though the invisible force no longer required him in full. He was still necessary, but not indispensable. His function was to anchor what had now begun to migrate into the structures forming around them, the growing institutions of law, commerce, and social expectation. The giant was fading into abstraction, just as power always does once it is codified. The widow began to map everything mentally: interactions, patterns, deviations, reactions. Each observation became a node in an invisible network she could recall at will. Memory became her weapon, and attention her shield. She understood now that a single mind, fully awake and fully aware, could see the architecture that centuries of obedience obscure. And then she made a choice that would mark her for life. She would no longer just survive. She would record, internalize, and interpret. She would study the system from within, quietly, invisibly, until comprehension became mastery. Because true power, she now knew, is never about muscle or size. It is about seeing the threads no one else can see, and knowing how to move through them without breaking. Autumn brought longer nights, and with them, a quiet intensity that the widow could not ignore. She had begun to understand that survival under Jakab's presence was no longer about protection or fear. It was about adaptation. Every action, every silence, every glance became a data point. She watched the reactions of men, animals, even the wind itself, sensing subtle shifts in pressure, timing, and expectation. The prairie had become a living laboratory, and she its only conscious observer. The seventh forbidden lesson revealed itself slowly. Influence can be anonymous. Power does not require visibility to shape outcomes. The giant could vanish tomorrow, and yet the patterns he had reinforced would persist, silently dictating behavior. Authority, once internalized, continues without enforcement. Laws codify it. Custom perpetuates it. Fear naturalizes it. And those who fail to recognize it are trapped before they even understand the perimeter of the cage. She noticed the neighbors now consulting her indirectly, offering decisions through implication, not dialogue. Letters arrived delayed, choices were subtly nudged, and even her own instincts seemed to echo expectations she had never consciously accepted. The system did not coerce. It conditioned. It sculpted perception until deviation appeared irrational, almost impossible. Jakab's presence had taught her another harsh truth. The visible enforcer is never the most dangerous. The system itself, unseen, internalized, and self-reinforcing, is the ultimate authority. Humans are, at best, instruments. Those who comprehend the instruments gain leverage. Those who do not, surrender entirely. The widow recognized she was no longer just surviving. She was decoding the architecture of domination itself. At night, she began writing sequences in her mind, memorizing patterns, calibrating every detail. She noticed how minor acts of unpredictability created subtle reverberations in the environment. A chair misplaced, a path walked differently, a phrase spoken with slight variation. These were probes into the system's responsiveness. She saw cause and effect at a depth no outsider could perceive. Jakab watched silently, but now she realized he was no longer the sole conduit of power. The pattern had become autonomous. He remained necessary only to maintain the illusion of his indispensability. And in that illusion lay a secret most never grasp. Once you understand the system, the illusion can be navigated, bent, and even repurposed. Her mind, sharpened by observation, began to map future possibilities. She saw potential vulnerabilities, weaknesses embedded not in men, but in the architecture of obedience itself. The prairie, the house, the people, even Jakab, all became nodes in a network she could read and interpret. Knowledge, she understood, was her only weapon. Awareness, her only shield. She whispered to herself, the words heavy with resolve. To survive is to see. To see is to gain power that even giants cannot wield. And somewhere deep in the night, she felt the first stirrings of control, quiet, subtle, and holy hairs. By the first frost, the widow realized that fear had become invisible. Not gone, not absent, but internalized. Men and women alike moved around the property as if anticipating something unspoken. Conversations shortened. Decisions hesitated. Even laughter was measured, calculated. She understood now that the system Jakab embodied had seeped beyond him, beyond the property, beyond the Frente itself. It was now embedded in the very rhythms of life around her. She tested the boundaries carefully, shifting small objects, altering routines, introducing imperceptible variations in her behavior. The environment responded instantly, almost instinctively. Animals hesitated on their paths, floors creaked differently, and the weight of doors shifted subtly. Every response was data. Every reaction mapped the architecture of invisible authority. She realized the eighth forbidden truth: power that can self-correct is more dangerous than power that enforces. It adapts, it learns, and it endures far longer than any human lifespan. Jakab remained a constant presence, but she now saw him as a node rather than the source. His stillness, his silence, his mere size, they were tools the system used to teach obedience, not the origin of the force itself. The pattern had begun to migrate into social institutions forming in the territory: councils, courts, property claims, trade networks. Physical dominance was becoming symbolic, and symbol, she understood, is far more potent. She observed herself changing, too. Where once she had acted for survival, she now acted for comprehension. Her mind catalogued interactions, adjusted for patterns, and tested outcomes. Her attention became a weapon. Observation became leverage. She could see the underlying mechanisms and predict the cascade of responses with unnaving accuracy. Awareness had become power, and power had become a strategy for survival she had never been taught but instinctively mastered. At night, she began to whisper mental instructions to herself, encoding the patterns she observed. She memorized sequences, calibrated reactions, and anticipated unseen influence. She realized that the house, the land, and even Jakab himself had become instruments of a system that could be read, understood, and navigated, if one dared to perceive the full depth. Halfway through her journey, she imagined speaking to others who might one day understand. "Type I and will in the comments," she would say, repeating the phrase twice. Not for show, but as a symbolic lock, a mental contract to acknowledge understanding, to declare alignment with awareness, to participate in the subtle awakening. Symbolic acts like this, she knew, reinforce identity within systems of influence, even when invisible. She felt the shift within herself. Survival was no longer enough. She was learning how to inhabit power without confrontation, how to navigate authority without rebellion, how to transform awareness into mastery. And in that moment, she understood the most dangerous truth of all: the system does not fear giants. It fears men and women who see the patterns behind the giants, who understand the architecture, who refuse to be invisible within it. She had become one of them, a witness, an analyst, a subtle disruptor, and the prairie, vast and silent, had become her classroom. By mid-autumn, the widow began to notice that even the most subtle acts carried consequences. A misplaced tool, a phrase spoken too loudly, or a hesitation in the wrong place rippled through the environment in ways she could barely detect, but she could sense them. The system, she realized, was no longer reactive to Jakab alone. It had begun to anticipate, calibrating itself around patterns, adjusting outcomes before actions could fully manifest. This was not superstition. It was mastery disguised as inevitability. She saw the ninth forbidden truth: domination thrives not on overt control but on predictive adjustment. The giant could enforce rules. The invisible system anticipates deviation, reshapes it, and absorbs it silently. Humans are easy to influence when they unconsciously internalize expectation. Once anticipation replaces fear, resistance becomes nearly impossible, because the mind aligns before the body acts. Her own mind became a laboratory. She experimented with intentional deviations, tiny anomalies designed to test the elasticity of control. Chairs slightly shifted, words deliberately chosen for ambiguity, tasks completed in unexpected sequences. The house, the land, and even the animals responded instinctively, almost preemptively. It was living proof of a system that could think without thinking, a network of influence that calibrated itself through interaction and observation. Jakab, ever present yet mostly silent, became increasingly enigmatic. His role as anchor was now clear. He did not create obedience, he embodied it. His size, his stillness, his minimal speech, all trained humans to defer without ever issuing explicit commands. And in that, She realized a 10th forbidden lesson. Power does not need to speak to be heard, nor to act to be felt. Presence alone reshapes perception. The widow's nights became workshops of cognition. She memoized patterns, anticipated behaviors, and mapped invisible lines of influence stretching across the property and beyond. Each realization deepened her understanding of control, not as brute force, but as architecture, as rhythm, as expectation. Survival was no longer reactive. It was strategic. Observation became a weapon, awareness became leverage, and subtlety became her shield. She began to plan, not for escape, not for confrontation, but for comprehension. She would chart the system fully, identify its vulnerabilities, and preserve knowledge that would otherwise vanish. This was dangerous work. Awareness alone attracts attention in a system that values conformity. And yet, she could not unsee what she had learned. Knowledge demanded responsibility. And so she continued, silent and observant, inhabiting a space between fear and mastery. Her understanding of the frontier, the giant, and the invisible patterns of power had grown so profound that she no longer saw herself as merely surviving. She was now an architect of perception, a silent witness to forces that had shaped men, institutions, and generations. The prairie had become her classroom, the giant, her instrument, and the system, now visible in its subtlety, had unknowingly made her a student and a master in the making. As winter approached, the widow's understanding of the invisible system reached new depths. The prairie, once raw and untamed, now felt like a living grid, each movement and sound a signal, each gesture and pause a data point. She could predict the responses of men, animals, and even nature itself with uncanny precision. The lesson was clear. Power does not always strike. It bends reality around itself, shaping outcomes before action occurs. She realized the 11th forbidden truth. Control is anticipatory. A system that predicts reactions effectively eliminates resistance before it manifests. Fear, force, and punishment are inefficient compared to subtle alignment. Those who survive are those who see the patterns and navigate them quietly, invisibly, without triggering recalibration. Her mind had become the one place the system could not fully dominate. Observation was her immunity. Awareness, her leverage. Jakab, still a towering presence, now served more as a living mirror than as an enforcer. His stillness reflected the expectations of the invisible framework, silently reinforcing the anticipatory patterns he had once fully embodied. He no longer needed to act to maintain obedience. His presence alone carried the weight of authority, translating invisible power into tangible effect. She observed and catalogued this endlessly. The widow began introducing minor disruptions intentionally, small variations in routine, subtle linguistic shifts, adjustments in spatial placement. Each one elicited almost imperceptible reactions. A tool slightly displaced, an animal pausing, a neighbor hesitating. These were proofs of a system that had evolved beyond visible enforcement. It responded to the faintest signal, calibrating itself like an organism, learning without consciousness, reproducing dominance without instruction. She understood the 12th forbidden lesson. Mastery comes not from confrontation, but from comprehension. The observer sees what the system cannot suppress. The one who perceives without interference maintains autonomy, while others unknowingly comply. She had entered a state where awareness itself became power, a form of survival that was invisible yet absolute. At night, she mapped the system in her mind. Patterns, rhythms, reactions, and adjustments formed a mental blueprint. The property, Jakab, and the surrounding land were all nodes within a complex network of influence. Each memory, each observation, each silent calculation fortified her autonomy, making her consciousness a repository of forbidden knowledge that could outlast men, giants, and institutions alike. She whispered a reminder to herself, as if anchoring it into reality. To observe is to survive. To comprehend is to wield influence. The prairie had become more than land. It was a classroom. The giant, more than a protector. He was a teacher. And the system, hidden yet omnipresent, was the curriculum she had been forced to master. Her awareness now carried weight. And weight, she knew, is the first form of control. By the first deep snow, the widow had begun to perceive patterns that others could not even imagine. Every movement of men, animals, and even natural elements carried information. Footsteps on frozen soil, the creak of timber under weight, the flight of birds. Each was a signal, a response, a calculation in the invisible algorithm of influence Jakab had anchored. She realized that the giant was no longer a man, but a node, and the system had begun to operate independently of him. She had reached the 13th forbidden truth. Control is self-propagating. Once a pattern of dominance is established, it continues without visible enforcement. It teaches itself through observation, repetition, and instinct. Obedience becomes habitual. Fear becomes internalized. And those who understand the pattern gain an advantage the system cannot fully anticipate. Awareness had become her shield and her weapon. Jakab's movements became slower, more deliberate, but also less critical to outcomes. The system no longer required him to impose order. Presence alone was enough, and even that could be partially replaced by the invisible currents of expectation and anticipatory compliance that stretched across the territory. She saw it clearly. The giant was a placeholder, a living anchor that would eventually be unnecessary. The widow experimented carefully, creating small deviations in routine. A tool left out of place. A path walked in reverse. A word spoken slightly differently. Each produced subtle, almost imperceptible adjustments in her environment. Floors shifted. Doors closed differently. Animals hesitated. The invisible system responded with efficiency, correcting imbalance before it became noticeable. Observation and subtle manipulation had become her way of testing the architecture of power itself. She began to feel the weight of knowledge pressing on her. To see the structure is one thing. To understand its vulnerabilities is another. Every detail she memorized, every pattern she catalogued, became part of a mental map no one else could access. The system could anticipate actions, but it could not read intention. And intention, fully informed by awareness, was the only variable beyond its control. Night brought no comfort, only reflection. She began to internalize sequences, predicting how influence propagated, visualizing the network, and calculating responses in advance. She understood that true mastery did not require confrontation, it required comprehension. Awareness itself became power, subtle yet absolute, invisible yet actionable. She whispered to herself, anchoring the lesson, to survive is not to resist, but to perceive. To perceive is to gain influence beyond the reach of force. And in that awareness, she felt the first stirrings of autonomy powerful enough to rival even giants. By the end of winter, the widow had begun to feel the full weight of invisible systems pressing against life itself. The giant, Jakab, remained present but was no longer central to the unfolding pattern. The lessons he embodied had been absorbed into the land, the routines, and the humans around her. Fear, expectation, and obedience had migrated into structures that did not need a body to enforce them. The prairie itself had become a vessel of influence. She discovered the 14th forbidden truth. Once a system internalizes its control, it no longer requires guardians. Authority becomes ambient. Compliance becomes instinctive. Even absence cannot diminish its power. And in such a system, awareness is both shield and weapon. Those who perceive patterns, where others see only routine, gain leverage unimaginable to those who follow blindly. The widow began to refine her tests, introducing calculated deviations that probed the limits of the invisible architecture. Tools left slightly askew. Animals guided along unconventional paths. Subtle changes in her voice or posture. Each deviation elicited small, almost imperceptible corrections from the environment. The system responded preemptively, adjusting outcomes before she could act further. Observation, she realized, was a form of interaction, a negotiation with forces that rarely reveal themselves. Jakab remained motionless more often, a sentinel whose presence now served symbolic rather than functional purpose. She understood that the visible enforcer was a teaching tool, a placeholder for patterns that had already learned to perpetuate themselves. He anchored compliance only until the invisible mechanisms matured. And she, who had observed from the inside, now understood the final layer of his function, to make domination legible without overt violence. Her own mind had transformed. Where once she moved and reacted, she now calculated and observed. She memorized sequences of behavior, recorded subtle environmental cues, and mapped relationships that had never been documented. Each observation became part of an internal blueprint she could recall at will. Knowledge, she understood, is the only form of control that cannot be forcibly erased. At night, she rehearsed the system in her mind, tracing the flow of influence across the property, the land, and the people. The giant had become irrelevant. The system had become autonomous. And she, fully aware, had become the only human capable of navigating its invisible currents without being consumed. She whispered a reminder to herself, a mantra of survival: comprehension is freedom. Awareness is power. And once you see the architecture, you cannot return to ignorance. She had crossed that threshold. There was no turning back. By early spring, the widow had begun to see the subtle ways the system used absence as much as presence. Jakab was no longer required to occupy space actively. His authority had become embedded in expectation. Men adjusted their movements, animals altered their patterns, and even the natural world seemed to align with the invisible architecture of power. She realized, with growing unease, that dominance was now self-sustaining. The 15th forbidden truth revealed itself clearly. Control that becomes invisible is nearly unstoppable. Once patterns are internalized, enforcement is automatic. Humans enforce their own obedience without realizing it. Fear is no longer necessary. Anticipation takes its place. And those who see the structure, like her, gain a rare vantage point, one that allows subtle influence without overt action. She experimented with the environment cautiously, introducing anomalies that tested its limits. A tool left in the wrong place. A path walked in a way that broke routine. A word spoken just slightly differently. Each anomaly produced an imperceptible correction, a floor creak, a hesitation, a subtle misalignment, but nothing catastrophic. The system adjusted quietly, demonstrating that its power was distributed, anticipatory, and resilient. Jakab, now more statue than man, observed without movement. She saw that his function had been completed. He had taught the lessons of dominance and presence, and the invisible mechanisms of control had fully absorbed them. He remained only as a symbolic anchor, a reminder that the patterns of compliance were real, tangible, and legible to anyone willing to see. Her own transformation was complete in subtle ways. Where once she reacted instinctively, she now processed deliberately. Each interaction, each movement, each sound became data, stored mentally as part of a larger map of influence. She had become a witness to the invisible, a navigator of currents most humans never perceived. Awareness, she understood, was now her currency. At night, she rehearsed sequences in her mind, tracing the flow of influence through every living node connected to the system. Each realization revealed new layers, deeper and more intricate than the last. And she understood the 16th forbidden truth: knowledge, once internalized, cannot be erased. Those who understand the patterns hold leverage the system cannot anticipate. Her resolve solidified. She would no longer merely survive or observe. She would catalog, interpret, and preserve understanding. And in that act, she became more dangerous than the giant himself, for she carried insight the system could not fully control, and she alone had the capacity to wield it wisely. By mid-spring, the widow understood something chilling. The system did not need Jakab. The giant had been a catalyst, a physical manifestation of authority to teach obedience, but the real force was invisible. It had migrated into behaviors, into expectations, into the unspoken patterns that governed every interaction. Humans complied without direction, institutions absorbed influence silently, and the prairie itself seemed to mirror the invisible architecture. The 16th forbidden truth revealed itself with clarity. Systems of control are most dangerous when they no longer require enforcers. Authority becomes ambient. Compliance becomes instinctive. Fear is no longer necessary because anticipation ensures obedience. And those who comprehend the pattern gain leverage that remains undetectable to the unobservant. Awareness, she realized, had become a form of mastery. She tested boundaries with subtlety. Chairs slightly askew. Tools left in unconventional places. Variations in timing and phrasing. Each minor disruption produced almost imperceptible corrections. Floors creaked differently. Animals hesitated. Even neighbors acted with small, unconscious adjustments. The system learned continuously, but her observation remained outside its scope. Awareness, she understood, is the one dimension no pattern can fully dominate. Jakab's stillness had become almost ceremonial. He no longer needed to enforce or intimidate. His presence alone sustained the illusion of dominance. He had fulfilled his role, and yet the system could operate independently. She understood that this was the ultimate lesson. Visible power is never the true source. The invisible currents, the patterns, the anticipatory mechanisms, those are the real instruments of control. The widow's mind had sharpened into a repository of forbidden knowledge. Every deviation, every reaction, every environmental cue was catalogued. She memoized sequences and predicted outcomes. Survival was no longer about avoiding harm. It was about comprehension. Observation had become her weapon, awareness a shield, and subtlety her strategy. At night, she rehearsed mental sequences, tracing the flow of influence across property lines, through human behavior, and into the emerging institutions of the territory. The giant, once a symbol of domination, was now irrelevant. The system operated autonomously, and she alone could navigate it with precision. She whispered to herself, to observe is to survive. To understand is to gain influence. And once the patterns are fully seen, the system no longer holds dominion over your mind. She had crossed the threshold. She was no longer merely protected. She was awake, aware, and quietly mastering the architecture of power itself. By late spring, the widow had begun to anticipate outcomes before they occurred. Every interaction, every gesture, every decision around the property carried signals she could interpret. Traders, neighbors, even the distant movements of animals reflected the invisible architecture Jakab had anchored. She realized that the giant had never been the source of control. He was merely a focal point for patterns that now operated independently, predicting and correcting deviations without overt enforcement. The 17th forbidden truth emerged. Control is most complete when it functions without notice. Systems that anticipate, correct, and internalize compliance render resistance almost impossible. Fear becomes unnecessary. Threat becomes irrelevant. Obedience becomes instinct. And only those who perceive the underlying mechanisms gain agency within the structure. Awareness, she realized, was the most dangerous form of influence. She experimented subtly, introducing minor variations to test the system's responsiveness. A door left slightly ajar, a phrase spoken at a different tempo, a pathway altered just enough to disrupt routine. Each action triggered adjustments invisible to others. The environment recalibrated. Animals hesitated. Neighbors unconsciously shifted behavior. The system was alive, self-correcting, and adaptive. She could observe it, but it could not anticipate her awareness. Jakab remained present, his massive form still an anchor, but his functional authority had diminished. He was now symbolic, a teaching artifact. The real power had migrated into invisible currents, woven into the expectations, habits, and instincts of those around him. She saw clearly. The visible enforcer is never the source of ultimate authority. The architecture of compliance operates silently, and once embedded, it endures beyond any individual. Her own mind had transformed into a repository of forbidden knowledge. She mapped behaviors, anticipated reactions, and memoized sequences. Observation became a strategy, attention became leverage, and understanding became survival. She no longer reacted to the environment. She navigated it with intent, learning the hidden rules and identifying where the system was vulnerable. At night, she whispered reminders to herself, anchoring lessons into memory. Comprehension is immunity. Awareness is influence. And once you perceive the architecture of control, you can navigate it, manipulate it, and, if necessary, outlast it. The widow had crossed the threshold from victim to observer, from passive participant to the only human capable of truly seeing the invisible forces at work. Her awareness had become her power, and in that realization, she understood the 18th forbidden truth. The system fears only those who can see it from within and remain undetected. By early summer, the widow's perception had sharpened into something uncanny. She no longer merely reacted to events, she predicted them. She sensed the invisible threads connecting people, land, and even time itself. Every conversation, every pause, every subtle glance became a node in a network she could interpret. The giant, Jakab, remained, but he had become secondary, a symbol, a placeholder, a conduit for a system now operating autonomously. The 19th forbidden truth revealed itself. Authority embedded in expectation can outlast the enforcer. Once obedience is internalized, the system maintains itself. Fear is no longer necessary. Control becomes ambient, silent, and continuous. And those who see the hidden mechanisms gain an extraordinary vantage point, the ability to influence without ever being detected. Awareness becomes leverage. Observation becomes power. She experimented cautiously, testing how far the system's anticipatory nature extended. A tool left slightly displaced, a pathway intentionally altered, a word spoken with subtle ambiguity. Each disruption caused imperceptible shifts. Floors creaked differently. Animals hesitated. Even human visitors unconsciously corrected themselves. The system adjusted silently, learning, calibrating, perpetuating dominance without ever speaking. Jakab, once the embodiment of power, had become almost ceremonial. His presence was still felt, but it no longer dictated outcomes. The invisible network he had anchored now functioned independently, subtly reinforcing compliance and expectation. She understood at last that visible power is rarely the true source. The architecture of anticipation and alignment governs far more than brute strength ever could. Her own mind had become a map of this system. She catalogued responses, memoized sequences, and anticipated behaviors. Observation replaced reaction. Awareness replaced fear. Survival became comprehension, and comprehension became subtle mastery. She now navigated the invisible currents with precision, understanding vulnerabilities the system did not know it possessed. At night, she whispered mental reminders. To see is to survive. To understand is to influence. Once patterns are perceived, the system cannot fully dominate you. She had become a silent witness, a student of control, and a master in the making. And she knew, with absolute certainty, the 20th forbidden truth: systems are only ever threatened by those who can observe without being observed. Her awareness had transformed into her weapon, her shield, and her leverage. And in that understanding, she realized that the frontier was no longer land. It was the architecture of influence itself. By midsummer, the widow realized that the pattern she observed extended far beyond the property. The invisible system Jakab had anchored now stretched into the territory itself, shaping decisions, movements, and interactions even in his absence. Traders, neighbors, and travelers unconsciously aligned with expectations established long before they arrived. Authority no longer required a visible enforcer. It had become a network, self-sustaining, and anticipatory. The 21st forbidden truth emerged. Dominance migrates into systems, and once embedded, it persists without enforcement. Compliance is no longer taught. It is internalized. The structure anticipates deviation, corrects it silently, and perpetuates itself. Fear and threat are only temporary tools. Real power is invisible, operating in the background, shaping outcomes without ever needing to announce itself. Awareness of these patterns is the only way to reclaim agency. The widow began introducing subtle experiments in her surroundings. She left objects slightly misplaced, varied her routines, and changed the cadence of her speech. Each alteration elicited imperceptible adjustments from the environment. Animals paused, doors shifted, neighbors hesitated. The system responded preemptively, demonstrating its ability to correct and adapt without overt action. She catalogued every response, embedding it into her internal map. Jakab had become almost irrelevant. His function now existed entirely in the symbolic realm, presence without necessity. The patterns of compliance had migrated into human behavior, routines, and expectation. She saw clearly that visible power is often a distraction. The invisible network of influence is far more durable. The giant had been a conduit, not the source. Her mental maps grew increasingly detailed. She predicted outcomes, traced feedback loops, and memorized the smallest cues. Observation became strategic. Awareness became leverage. Survival was no longer about reaction. It was about comprehension. She realized she had crossed a threshold few ever reach, understanding the architecture of control while remaining undetected within it. At night,